We were hiding in her house. She saved all my family, 6 persons, and thanks to her, now she can see all our large family. All this thanks to her.
In the chaos of World War II, when fear was everywhere and people were turning their backs on one another, there was Elisabeta Nicopoi, a seamstress in Romania, who, without any fanfare or recognition, decided to make a stand. She wasn't a soldier or a politician. She didn't have power or influence. She had a needle, some fabric, and a burning sense of what was right. Her acts of quiet defiance saved lives, including her future husband's, and turned her small sewing shop into a haven of hope. This is the story of how one ordinary woman became an extraordinary hero by simply refusing to stand by and watch her world fall apart. In June 1941, the world of Iasi turned into a nightmare. The Hitler men, aided by Romanian police, launched a vicious assault on the Jewish community. The air crackled with the terror of gunfire, the shouts of soldiers, and the cries of innocent families being dragged from their homes. For the Jewish people, there was no refuge. There were no warnings, no second chances, only brutality. Men, women, children were ripped from the arms of their loved ones. Thousands were shot in cold blood, their bodies falling lifeless into the streets they once walked in peace. Others were crammed into suffocating train cars. No windows, no air, no water. Demise was everywhere, and it came swiftly. The lucky ones suffocated quickly. Others weren't so fortunate. But in the midst of this horror, there was a spark of light, a flicker of defiance. Elisabeta Nicopoi wasn't Jewish. She didn't have to wear the yellow Star of David that marked her neighbors for demise. But when she saw her friends, her co-workers, forced to bear this humiliating mark, something inside her snapped. These weren't strangers. They were people she loved. How could she do nothing? So, in a gesture of solidarity, she sewed her own Star of David and wore it with pride. The symbol that was meant to isolate, to shame, became her badge of rebellion. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes. Elisabeta was not going to stand by. Soon, the whispers began. The rumors of what was to come. The pogrom, the arrests, the beatings, the executions. The fear hung thick in the air, pressing in on every corner of the city like a suffocating fog. But while others turned their backs, Elisabeta ran toward the danger. She learned of the impending terror about to be unleashed on the Jewish population, and without a moment's hesitation, she went door to door, telling her neighbors what was coming. Her heart raced, not from fear for her own safety, but from the urgency of saving lives. She warned anyone she could. Among them was a young man, Marcus Struhl, a co-worker, a friend, a man whose life she would one day save in more ways than one. When Marcus heard her words, his world cracked open. The fear that had been gnawing at him became a reality, but it wasn't too late. Because of Elisabeta, he had time. He rushed to his family, telling them of the storm that was about to hit. His mother, father, siblings, they all needed to escape. But where? Where could they go? How could they hide when the city was crawling with soldiers ready to kill them on sight? That's when Elisabeta made a choice that would put her own life in unimaginable danger. She offered her home as a refuge. 20 people, including the Struhl family, crammed into a small, hidden storeroom. 20 people, sitting in silence, praying that each passing footstep wouldn't be the last thing they heard. For 2 weeks, Elisabeta risked everything to keep them safe. Every day she sneaked them food, knowing that if she was caught, the punishment would be swift and merciless. The weight of fear must have been unbearable. Every knock at the door, every shout in the street must have sent shivers down her spine. But she didn't falter. Even when the Hitler men stormed into homes, dragged men and women into the streets, she stood firm. Her hands, once used to stitching seams, were now the hands that stitched lives back together. For 2 weeks, Elisabeta was their lifeline, their protector, their silent guardian. Elisabeta Nicopoi had always known how to make herself invisible. Her life was routine, stitching hems, patching worn coats, and creating dresses for women she'd known since childhood. She wasn't the kind of person people noticed. She liked it that way. It allowed her to observe the world without being seen, to absorb the stories that drifted through the shop like the dust motes in the sunlight. But in the summer of 1941, everything changed. The streets that had once echoed with the sounds of children laughing and vendors calling out their wares now rang with the heavy boots of soldiers. Iasi had become a city on the edge of a knife, and everyone could feel it. It was June 28th when the storm finally broke. Elisabeta had woken to the sound of shouting outside her window. Her heart sank as she rushed to the front of her apartment, pulling back the curtain just in time to see a group of German soldiers dragging her neighbor, Mr. Goldstein, out of his house. His face was bloodied, his hands bound behind his back. His wife, a petite woman with gray streaks in her hair, was screaming, begging for mercy, but the soldiers ignored her. Elisabeta stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. But seeing the brutal reality unfold in front of her, was like being struck by lightning. The air was thick with tension. From her window, Elisabeta could see people peeking out from behind their curtains, eyes wide with fear, but no one dared step outside. The streets were no longer safe. And then she heard it. Whispers carried on the wind. The Hitler men were coming for all of them, the entire Jewish community in Iasi. They were to be rounded up, arrested, and packed into train cars. For what? No one knew, but the rumors spoke of demise camps, of forced labor, of places so horrific that people didn't come back. Elisabeta's heart pounded in her chest. Her friends, her neighbors, how could she just stand by and let this happen? She had always been small and unassuming, someone who could slip through the cracks unnoticed. But on that day, something inside her shifted. Fear gripped her, yes, but so did an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She knew she couldn't save everyone, but she could try to save someone. She grabbed her coat, barely stopping to put it on, and rushed out into the rain-soaked streets. The wind howled, pulling at her clothes as she made her way toward the Jewish quarter, her footsteps echoing off the cobblestone streets. Every shadow, every passing glance felt like a threat. She kept her head down, moving quickly, praying no one would stop her. When she reached Marcus Struhl's home, she didn't even bother knocking. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her clothes dripping from the rain. Marcus's mother, Esther, looked up in surprise, her face pale and lined with worry. "Elisabeta," she whispered. "What's happening? What have you heard?" "They're coming," Elisabeta replied, her voice breathless from the run. "The soldiers, they're rounding people up. You have to hide, all of you." Esther's eyes widened in terror, and she quickly called for her husband and children. Marcus appeared from the back room, his face tight with fear. He had heard the rumors too, and now, seeing the panic in Elisabeta's eyes, he knew they were true. "We don't have anywhere to go," he said, his voice barely audible. Elisabeta's mind raced. She knew they couldn't stay here. The soldiers would come for them soon, and then an idea struck her. "My storeroom," she said suddenly. "It's small, but it's hidden. No one will think to look there." Within minutes, the Struhl family had gathered what little they could carry, blankets, food, anything they could fit into small bags, and followed Elisabeta back to her apartment. The rain had turned into a downpour, the sound of it hammering against the rooftops, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for what was happening in the city below. Elisabeta led them into her tiny apartment, past the kitchen, and into the cramped storeroom in the back. It was barely large enough to fit the 5 of them, but it would have to do. For 2 weeks, Elisabeta cared for them in secret. She brought them food, water, anything she could sneak past the soldiers patrolling the streets. Every time she left the apartment, her heart pounded in her chest, terrified that this would be the day she would be caught. But she had no choice. The Struhls were relying on her. She couldn't fail them. The city outside had become a place of demise and despair. The soldiers had taken hundreds, maybe thousands of Jews from their homes, herding them into trucks like cattle, packing them into trains that left the city and never returned. Elisabeta could hear the screams at night, the sound of people being ripped from their homes, of families torn apart. She could do nothing for them, but she could keep the Struhls safe. Late one night, after the city had fallen eerily silent, Marcus pulled Elisabeta aside. His eyes, once so full of life, were now dark with exhaustion and fear. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You're risking your life for us. Why?" Elisabeta looked at him, her throat tightening with emotion. She hadn't stopped to think about why. She just knew that she couldn't stand by and do nothing. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said softly. "Because you're my friends, and because no one deserves what's happening out there." Tears filled Marcus's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. "You've saved us," he whispered. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Elisabeta shook her head. "There's nothing to repay," she said firmly. "We survived together, or not at all." When the worst of the raids had passed, and it was finally safe for the Struhl family to leave, they emerged from the storeroom shaken, but alive. The city was forever changed, scarred by the violence that had ripped through its streets. But for Marcus, his family, and the others Elisabeta had warned, there was still hope. They had been saved because one woman, small, unassuming, invisible to most, had found the courage to stand in the shadows and fight back against the darkness. Years later, when Elisabeta and Marcus married, they often spoke of those days, of the fear and the danger, but also of the bond that had been forged in those moments of desperation. Their love had grown not just from survival, but from a shared understanding of what it meant to risk everything for the people you care about. Elisabeta had never considered herself a hero. She was just a seamstress, after all, someone who stitched together the lives of others with care and quiet strength. But to the Struhl family, and to all those she had saved, she was more than that. She was their protector, their lifeline, their light in the darkness. The hum of the sewing machine filled the small room, its rhythmic sound a comfort to Elisabeta Nicopoi. Her hands moved with practiced precision, guiding the fabric beneath the needle, her mind focused on the task at hand. It was an ordinary day in the seamstress's shop, the kind of day she had lived countless times before. But in 1941, even ordinary days were fraught with tension. The war had changed everything. Iasi, once a lively city full of color and life, was now a place of fear. People moved through the streets with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, as if trying to make themselves invisible. The Jewish community, especially, had become targets. The yellow Star of David, sewn onto their clothing, marked them for persecution. It was a symbol of shame, a way for the authorities to identify and dehumanize them. And yet, for Elisabeta, it was something else entirely. She had first seen the star on Mrs. Goldstein, a kind older woman who had been one of her best customers for years. Mrs. Goldstein had always been full of life, always quick with a smile or a kind word. But now, as she stood in the doorway of the shop, her eyes downcast, the yellow star stark against her worn coat, she looked like a shadow of the woman she had once been. "Mrs. Goldstein," Elisabeta greeted her, trying to keep her voice light as if nothing had changed. But it had. They both knew it. Mrs. Goldstein smiled weakly, her hands trembling as she handed over a bundle of fabric. "I need a new dress," she said softly. "I don't know when I'll be able to come back." Elisabeta nodded, her throat tight. She took the fabric without a word and set to work, her hands moving automatically as her mind raced. The yellow star. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. These people, her friends, her neighbors, were being marked, branded like cattle. It was an injustice she couldn't ignore. That night, after closing the shop, Elisabeta sat at her sewing table, the quiet of the room pressing in around her. She pulled out a piece of yellow fabric and stared at it for a long time. The Star of David had become a symbol of hatred, of persecution. But maybe, just maybe, she could turn it into something else, something that spoke of solidarity, of defiance. Her hands moved before her mind had fully processed what she was doing. She cut the fabric into the shape of the star, then carefully sewed it onto her own coat. The stitches were small and neat, each one imbued with a sense of purpose. When she finished, she stood and put the coat on, feeling the weight of the star on her chest. It was heavy, not in a physical sense, but in the knowledge of what it represented. She wasn't Jewish, she didn't have to wear this, but she would, because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, Elisabeta stepped out of her apartment and into the streets of Iasi, her heart pounding in her chest. The star felt like a beacon, drawing the eyes of everyone she passed. She could feel their stares, some curious, some hostile, others confused. But she kept her head high, walking with a quiet determination. She wasn't ashamed, She wasn't afraid. She was making a statement, even if it was only a small one. As she walked, she passed by the market where vendors were setting up their stalls. She could hear the whispers, the murmurs of people trying to make sense of what they were seeing. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him, Marcus Struhl. He was standing at the edge of the market, his coat adorned with the same yellow star, his face pale and drawn. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus made his way toward her, his steps slow, almost hesitant. When he reached her, he didn't speak at first. He simply stared at the star on her coat, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Elisabeta," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you wearing that?" Elisabeta smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "Because," she said quietly, "I stand with you, with all of you." Marcus's eyes filled with emotion, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. Finally, he nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." The two stood there in the middle of the market, their yellow stars shining like beacons of defiance in a world that had turned against them. In that moment, Elisabeta knew that she had made the right choice. It didn't matter what people thought. It didn't matter what the consequences might be. What mattered was that she had chosen to stand up for what was right, to show her friends, her neighbors, that they weren't alone. For weeks, Elisabeta wore the star everywhere she went. It became a part of her, a symbol of solidarity that she carried with her in everything she did. Some people stared, others whispered, but no one dared confront her. She was just a seamstress after all. What harm could she do? But Elisabeta knew better. She knew that even the smallest acts of defiance could have a ripple effect, could inspire others to take a stand. And so she continued to wear the star, continued to move through the streets of Iasi, with her head held high, even as the world around her crumbled. The room was cold, so cold that it made Elisabeta's teeth chatter, though she tried her best to keep her composure. The floor was hard beneath her, the concrete biting into her skin where she sat, her back against the wall. Her wrists were bound tightly behind her, the rope cutting into her flesh, leaving angry red marks that throbbed with pain. But she didn't focus on the pain. She couldn't. If she did, she would lose herself to it. And that was something she couldn't afford. The Hitler men had found her. For weeks, she had been hiding Jewish families in her storeroom, sneaking them food and water, doing everything she could to keep them safe from the soldiers who roamed the streets of Iasi like wolves hunting their prey. She had known the risks. She had known that at any moment, someone might betray her, might tell the authorities what she was doing. But she had done it anyway. Because what choice did she have? How could she sit by and do nothing while people were being hunted, while families were being torn apart? She couldn't. So she hadn't. Now, the price for her defiance was clear. The door to the small, dimly lit cell creaked open, and two soldiers entered. Their faces were hard, cruel, their eyes glittering with malice. One of them held a whip, the leather coiled tightly in his hand, ready to strike. The other stepped toward her, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her to her feet. Elisabeta winced, but she refused to let them see her pain. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "You think you're clever, don't you?" The soldier sneered, his voice low and dangerous. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "You think you can hide them from us?" Elisabeta's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face blank, her expression steady. She wouldn't show them fear. She wouldn't give them what they wanted. The soldier with the whip stepped forward, uncoiling the leather with a sharp flick of his wrist. The sound echoed through the room, sending a shiver down Elisabeta's spine. But she stood her ground, refusing to flinch. "Tell us where they are," the soldier demanded, his voice laced with menace. "Tell us, and maybe we'll let you go." Elisabeta clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She knew they were lying. Even if she told them, they wouldn't let her go. They would kill her, and worse, they would kill the families she had been trying to protect. There was no escape, no way out. But she couldn't betray them. She couldn't let all her efforts, all her sacrifices be for nothing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her insides. The whip cracked through the air before she could even blink, the leather slicing across her back with a sharp, blinding pain. Elisabeta gasped, biting down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. She wouldn't break. Again and again the whip came down, each blow more vicious than the last. The pain was unbearable, searing through her like fire, but still she stayed silent. She wouldn't give in. She couldn't. The faces of the families she had saved flashed through her mind. Marcus, his mother, his father, his siblings. She thought of the children, their wide, frightened eyes as they hid in her storeroom, waiting for the soldiers to pass by. She had to protect them. She had to endure. Finally, after what felt like hours, the soldiers stepped back, panting from the effort of their brutality. Elisabeta's body was broken, her skin raw and bleeding, but her spirit remained unbroken. She looked up at them, her gaze unwavering. "You can beat me all you want," she said through gritted teeth, her voice hoarse from the pain. "But I will never tell you where they are." The soldiers exchanged a glance, frustration flickering in their eyes. They had expected her to break, to beg for mercy. But Elisabeta wasn't like the others. She was stronger. She was defiant. And she had no intention of giving them what they wanted. Without another word, the soldiers turned and left the cell, slamming the door behind them. Elisabeta was alone once more, the silence of the room pressing in around her like a suffocating blanket. She closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had survived. The pain was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the satisfaction she felt deep in her chest. She had refused to break. She had protected them. As long as she was still breathing, she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop fighting. Not for herself, but for the people she loved, for the people who had become her family. Elisabeta Nicopoi's sewing machine had always been a source of comfort. The rhythmic sound of the needle moving in and out of the fabric, the soft swish of material sliding under her fingers. It was how she had built her life, one stitch at a time. Her hands were skilled and steady, able to take a piece of cloth and transform it into something beautiful, something useful. But in 1941, when the war came crashing into Iasi and the world she knew began to unravel, the meaning behind her stitches began to change. It started with the stars. The yellow Star of David, sewn crudely onto the clothes of her Jewish neighbors, was a badge of shame forced upon them by the German occupiers. Overnight, people she had known her whole life were branded, marked for humiliation, persecution, and worse. The streets felt heavier now, filled with a thick tension that suffocated the city. Elisabeta watched from the window of her shop as the world around her shifted into something unrecognizable. The Jewish families she had known for years, people who had been her friends, her customers, were no longer free to move about the city as they once had. They walked with their heads down, avoiding the eyes of those who now looked at them with disdain or, worse, indifference. She couldn't stop thinking about the stars. Those yellow patches, they were meant to isolate, to humiliate, to strip people of their dignity. Every time she saw one, a knot of anger twisted in her stomach. How could something so small, so insignificant in appearance, carry so much weight? How could a patch of fabric become a tool for hatred? One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the idea came to her. Elisabeta didn't think of herself as brave. She wasn't someone who stood up in front of crowds and made speeches, but she was someone who understood the power of symbols, and she knew that if the Hitler men were going to use a piece of fabric to dehumanize her neighbors, maybe she could use her skills to fight back. She took a deep breath and gathered her sewing supplies. With trembling hands, she began to cut a piece of yellow fabric into the shape of a star, just like the ones the Jews were forced to wear. But this one would be different. She wouldn't wear it because someone told her to. She would wear it because she chose to. As she stitched the star onto her own coat, Elisabeta thought about her friend Miriam, who used to visit the shop every week with her 2 children. Miriam, who had once been so full of laughter and light, had become a shadow of herself, shrinking under the weight of the yellow star she now wore. The thought of Miriam's sadness fueled Elisabeta's resolve. She would not let the world believe that people like Miriam were alone. She would wear the star too, in solidarity, as a symbol of resistance against the hate that had taken over the city. The next morning, Elisabeta stepped out of her apartment wearing the star she had sewn the night before. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear bubbling up inside her as she walked down the street. What if someone saw? What if the authorities stopped her? What if they realized she wasn't Jewish and punished her for trying to make a statement? But the fear didn't stop her. It fueled her. With each step, she grew more determined, more certain that this small act of defiance could make a difference. People stared as she passed, their eyes lingering on the star sewn onto her coat. Some looked confused, others shocked, and a few even glared, their lips curling in disdain. But Elisabeta kept walking. When she arrived at the market, she saw Miriam standing near a stall, holding the hands of her 2 children. Miriam hadn't noticed her yet. Her gaze was downcast, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the star on her coat had drained the life out of her. Elisabeta's heart ached at the sight of her friend, but she knew what she had to do. "Elisabeta?" Miriam's voice was barely a whisper as she looked up and saw her. Her eyes went wide when she noticed the star on Elisabeta's coat. For a moment she didn't speak, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. "I'm with you," Elisabeta said softly, her voice steady. "We all are. We're not going to let them do this alone." Tears welled up in Miriam's eyes and she reached out to grab Elisabeta's hands, squeezing them tightly. "But why? You don't have to wear it. You're not like us." Elisabeta shook her head, a lump forming in her throat. "No," she agreed. "I'm not like you. But that doesn't mean I can't stand beside you." The 2 women stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the world around them pressing in. But there was something else there too, a spark of hope. Elisabeta could see it in Miriam's eyes, the way her shoulders lifted just a little, the way she stood a little taller. For the first time in weeks, Miriam looked like herself again, even if just for a moment. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Word traveled fast in Iasi, and soon people were whispering about the seamstress who wore the star. Some called her brave, others called her foolish, but Elisabeta didn't care what they thought. She hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because it was right, but wearing the star wasn't enough. As the days passed, the situation in Iasi grew worse. The rumors of arrests, deportations, and demise camps were no longer just whispers. They were becoming reality. Jewish families were being dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, disappearing without a trace. The air was thick with fear, and Elisabeta knew she couldn't stand by any longer. One evening, after closing her shop, Elisabeta sat at her sewing table, her hands trembling as she thought about what was happening. She couldn't sew dresses anymore, not while the people she loved were being hunted. She had to do something. Her fingers moved instinctively, cutting fabric, threading the needle. But this time, she wasn't sewing dresses. She was creating hiding places. Over the next few weeks, Elisabeta transformed her shop into a secret sanctuary. She sewed false bottoms into boxes, created hidden compartments in the walls, and turned her storeroom into a place where families could hide when the soldiers came looking for them. It wasn't much, but it was all she had, and it was enough. The first family she hid was Miriam's. One night, when the air was thick with the sound of boots marching in the streets, Miriam came to her face pale with fear. "They're coming for us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We have nowhere to go." Without a word, Elisabeta led Miriam and her children into the back of her shop, where she had prepared a small space hidden behind a wall of fabric bolts. It wasn't much, barely enough room for the 3 of them to sit, but it was safe. "Stay quiet," she whispered as she closed the hidden door. "I'll come back when it's safe." For days, Elisabeta smuggled food and water to the hidden family, her heart pounding with fear every time she stepped outside. She knew that if she was caught, the punishment would be severe. But she didn't care. Miriam and her children were worth the risk. One night, as she was bringing bread to the storeroom, she heard footsteps outside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly hid behind a stack of fabric bolts, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door to her shop creaked open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the room. "Is anyone here?" a voice called out, sharp and commanding. Elisabeta's heart raced, but she stayed perfectly still, her body pressed tightly against the wall. The footsteps grew louder as the soldiers moved through the shop, their voices low and menacing. She could hear them rummaging through her things, their frustration growing as they found nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded, and the door slammed shut behind them. Elisabeta waited, her body trembling with fear, until she was sure they were gone. Then she rushed to the storeroom, her heart in her throat. Miriam was there, her arms wrapped tightly around her children, their faces pale but unharmed. "They're gone," Elisabeta whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're safe." Miriam's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Elisabeta into a tight embrace. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved my family." Elisabeta shook her head, her throat tightening with emotion. "I did what I had to do," she replied softly, "and I'll keep doing it for as long as I can." For months, Elisabeta continued to hide families in her shop, risking her life every day to keep them safe. The war raged on, but in her little corner of the world, she sowed hope, one stitch at a time. She wasn't a soldier or a leader, she was just a seamstress. But to the families she saved, she was a hero. And in the end, that was all that mattered. But even then, Elisabeta's heart wouldn't allow her to rest. She traveled to these camps, risking her life to bring the men clothes and food. It was a risk that could have cost her everything. And eventually, it did. The Hitler men found her. They arrested her. They beat her. They tried to break her, but they couldn't. Elisabeta's spirit was like iron. With every blow, every lash, her resolve grew stronger. She had tasted fear, yes, but she had also tasted courage. She had seen the faces of the people she saved, and that was enough. She knew that in a world filled with cruelty, kindness was the sharpest weapon of all. After the war, Elisabeta and Marcus, bound together not just by survival but by a deep and abiding love, were married. The man she had once saved was now her partner in life. Together, they rebuilt their lives, leaving the horrors of Romania behind and making Aliyah to Israel in 1963. They started a new chapter in Haifa, but Elisabeta's past was always with her. It wasn't something she wore on her sleeve, but it was there, in the quiet moments, in the look in her eyes that had seen more than anyone ever should.